The morning sun cast long shadows across the military base as Sarah Chun adjusted her medical bag for what felt like the 100th time that week. At 28, she had the kind of calm presence that made wounded soldiers feel safe the moment she walked into a room. Her black hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, and her uniform was always perfectly pressed, giving her the appearance of someone who followed rules to the letter. The other Navy SEALs on the base knew her as the quiet nurse who worked the night shifts in the medical bay. She had been stationed at the forward operating base in Afghanistan for 6 months, and in that time, she had treated everything from minor cuts to life-threatening injuries. The soldiers respected her medical skills, but they saw her as someone who belonged in the safety of the hospital tent, not on the battlefield. What they didn't know was that Sarah had a past she never talked about. Growing up in a small town in California, Sarah had been raised by her grandfather, a former Marine who had served in Vietnam. He had taught her things that most little girls never learned. While her friends were playing with dolls, Sarah was learning how to field strip an assault rifle. While they were having tea parties, she was practicing hand-to-hand combat in the backyard. Her grandfather, Chun Wei, had fled China during the Communist Revolution. He carried with him not just his military training, but ancient fighting techniques that had been passed down through generations of his family. Sarah absorbed everything he taught her like a sponge, showing a natural talent that even surprised the old warrior. By the time she was 16, Sarah could outshoot most adults at the local shooting range. She could move through the woods without making a sound, track animals for miles, and defend herself against multiple attackers. But she also excelled in school, particularly in biology and chemistry. When it came time for college, she chose nursing, wanting to save lives rather than take them. Her grandfather had been proud, but also worried. A warrior's skills are like a sword, he had told her. They must be kept sharp, even if you hope never to use them. Sarah had continued training throughout nursing school, maintaining her edge while learning to heal instead of harm. After graduation, she joined the Navy as a hospital corpsman, thinking she could serve her country while staying true to her desire to help others. The base in Afghanistan was her first real deployment. It was a small outpost, home to about 200 personnel, including a special operations unit of Navy SEALs who were conducting raids against Taliban leadership in the region. The base was considered relatively safe, protected by high walls, guard towers, and constant patrols. Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison was the leader of the SEAL team. He was a decorated veteran with multiple deployments under his belt, known for his tactical brilliance and his ability to keep his men alive in impossible situations. He had noticed Sarah during her first week on base, impressed by her competence and professionalism, but, like everyone else, he saw her as a medical professional, not a warrior. The SEALs would often joke about the nurses and support staff, not out of disrespect, but because they lived in such different worlds. The SEALs went out into the darkness to hunt enemies, while the medical staff waited safely on base to treat whoever came back wounded. Sarah never corrected their assumptions. She did her job quietly and efficiently, treating their injuries, monitoring their health, and preparing them for their next mission. She had learned early in life that it was often better to be underestimated than to reveal your true capabilities too soon. The base operated on a strict schedule. The SEALs would conduct missions at night when they had the advantage of superior night vision equipment and training. They would return before dawn, often bringing wounded enemies who would receive medical treatment regardless of which side they fought for. Sarah had treated dozens of Taliban fighters, always maintaining her professional demeanor even when treating men who had been trying to kill American soldiers just hours before. It was during one of these routine medical treatments that Sarah first noticed something was wrong. A wounded Taliban fighter had been brought in after a firefight in a nearby village. He was young, maybe 19 or 20, with a bullet wound his shoulder. As Sarah worked to clean and dress the wound, she listened to him talking to another wounded prisoner in rapid Pashto. Sarah's grandfather had taught her that a warrior must always be aware of her surroundings, and part of that awareness included understanding what people were saying around her. During her deployments, she had picked up enough Pashto and Dari to understand basic conversations, but she kept this skill to herself. What she heard made her blood run cold. The young fighter was telling his companion about a planned attack on the base. Not just any attack, but a massive coordinated assault involving over 100 fighters. They had been planning it for weeks, studying the base's defenses, learning the patrol schedules, and identifying weak points in the perimeter. The attack was planned for the next night, when most of the SEALs would be out on a mission. Intelligence had been leaked to the Taliban about the timing of the operation, and they knew the base would be at its most vulnerable. The plan was to overwhelm the remaining defenders, capture or kill the American personnel, and turn the base into a propaganda victory. Sarah continued working on the prisoner's wound, her face showing no emotion even as her mind raced. She needed to report what she had heard, but she also needed to be careful. If the Taliban had a source of intelligence about SEAL operations, then there might be a security leak on the base. She couldn't be sure who to trust. That evening, she approached Lieutenant Commander Morrison as he was preparing for the night's mission. She requested a private meeting, which he granted, though he seemed puzzled by the serious expression on her face. "Sir, I need to report something urgent," she said once they were alone in his office. "I overheard the prisoners talking about an attack planned for tomorrow night." Morrison leaned forward, his attention now fully focused. "What exactly did you hear?" Sarah repeated the conversation in detail, translating the Pashto as accurately as she could remember. Morrison's expression grew more serious with each word. "You understand Pashto?" he asked. "Some. Enough to understand what they were saying." Morrison studied her for a long moment. "Why didn't you mention this skill before?" "I didn't think it was relevant to my duties as a medic," Sarah replied, which was technically true, even if it wasn't the complete truth. Morrison nodded slowly. "This is valuable intelligence, Petty Officer Chun. I'll need to report this up the chain of command immediately." But as they discussed the details of what Sarah had overheard, both of them realized they faced a serious problem. If the Taliban knew about the timing of the SEAL mission, it meant they had accurate intelligence about base operations. There was a leak somewhere, and until they identified it, they couldn't trust normal communication channels. Morrison made a decision that would change everything. He would cancel the night's mission and keep his team on base, but he wouldn't report the reason through normal channels. Instead, he would prepare for the attack Sarah had overheard, but he would keep the intelligence to a small circle of trusted personnel. What neither of them realized was that the Taliban's intelligence was even better than Sarah had overheard. The attack wasn't planned for the next night. It was planned for tonight. And it wasn't just 100 fighters. It was nearly 200 armed with rockets, mortars, and suicide vests. As Sarah returned to the medical bay to prepare for what might be coming, she made her own decision. She retrieved a small locked case from her personal belongings, something she hadn't opened since arriving at the base. Inside were items that most nurses wouldn't carry: a custom-modified pistol, several magazines of ammunition, a tactical knife, and a few other tools that her grandfather had insisted she always keep close. She had hoped she would never need them, but a true warrior was always prepared. The attack began at 0200 hours, just as the base was at its quietest. The first sign of trouble was when the perimeter alarms went silent. Not because there was no threat, but because the Taliban had managed to disable them during their approach. Sarah was in the medical bay, updating patient charts, when she heard the first explosion. It came from the north side of the base, followed quickly by automatic gunfire and shouting. The lights in the medical bay flickered and went out as the base's power grid was hit. Emergency lighting kicked in, bathing everything in an eerie red glow. Sarah could hear Morrison's voice over the base communication system, calling all personnel to battle stations, but his transmission was cut short by another explosion, this one much closer. Through the small window of the medical bay, Sarah could see muzzle flashes in the darkness as Taliban fighters poured through breaches in the base's perimeter. The attack was coming from multiple directions simultaneously, exactly as the prisoner had described, but the scale was even larger than she had anticipated. Sarah moved quickly through the darkened medical bay, checking on the patients who were too wounded to evacuate. There were 6 of them, including the 2 Taliban prisoners who had provided the intelligence about the attack. The irony wasn't lost on her that she might now die defending the same men who had helped plan her death. The sound of gunfire was getting closer. Sarah could hear American voices shouting orders, trying to organize a defense, but it was clear they were outnumbered and caught off guard despite Morrison's preparations. She made a quick decision. The patients who could walk needed to be moved to a more secure location. The medical bay was too exposed, with large windows and thin walls. There was a supply bunker about 50 yards away that would provide better protection. As she began moving the walking wounded toward the back exit of the medical bay, the front door exploded inward. 3 Taliban fighters rushed in, their AK-47s raised and ready to fire. Sarah was crouched behind a medical cart with 2 wounded American soldiers who were barely conscious. The Taliban fighters were sweeping the room methodically, checking behind every piece of equipment. In seconds, they would find her and the patients. This was the moment Sarah had trained for her entire life, even though she had hoped it would never come. She drew her pistol in one smooth motion, her grandfather's training taking over. The first fighter was checking behind a cabinet 15 feet away when Sarah's first shot took him in the head. The second fighter turned toward the sound, but Sarah was already moving, rolling behind another piece of equipment as his burst of automatic fire shredded the medical cart where she had been hiding. The third fighter had better instincts. Instead of firing wildly, he moved to flank Sarah's position while his partner kept her pinned down. It was a smart tactical move, one that would have worked against most opponents. But Sarah wasn't most opponents. She had been tracking both fighters by sound, her grandfather's lessons about battlefield awareness serving her well. When the flanking fighter moved around the corner of the supply cabinet, Sarah was waiting for him. Her knife took him in the throat before he could raise his weapon. The second fighter realized his partner was down and panicked, spraying automatic fire across the room without aiming. Sarah used his muzzle flashes to locate his exact position, then put 3 rounds center mass before he could reload. The entire engagement had lasted less than 30 seconds. Sarah quickly checked on her patients. One of the American soldiers had taken shrapnel from the door explosion, but his wounds weren't life-threatening. She bandaged him quickly, then began moving all the patients toward the supply bunker. As they made their way across the open ground between buildings, Sarah could see the full scope of the attack. The Taliban had indeed brought a massive force, and they were systematically overrunning the base's defenses. Explosions lit up the night sky, and the sound of gunfire was almost continuous. She could see American defenders taking cover behind sandbags and concrete barriers, but they were being overwhelmed by sheer numbers. The Taliban fighters were advancing in coordinated groups, using covering fire and tactical movements that show they had been well trained for this assault. Sarah got her patients to the supply bunker and made sure they were as safe as possible given the circumstances. But as she looked back toward the main part of the base, she realized that safety was relative. If the Taliban succeeded in overrunning the base, nowhere would be safe. She could stay in a bunker and hope for the best, or she could do something about it. Sarah checked her equipment one more time. She had her pistol with 4 magazines, her knife, and a few other items. It wasn't much against a force of nearly 200 fighters, but her grandfather had always taught her that a true warrior used whatever tools were available. She looked at the wounded soldiers under her care. "I'll be back," she promised them, though she wasn't sure she believed it herself. Then, she stepped back into the darkness, moving toward the sound of battle. The quiet nurse was about to become something else entirely, something the Taliban had never encountered before and would never see coming. The real fight was about to begin. Era moved through the darkness like a shadow, using every technique her grandfather had taught her about stealth and battlefield movement. The Taliban fighters were advancing in groups, focused on their assault on the main defensive positions, and they never noticed the lone figure moving parallel to their advance. She had studied the base's layout during her 6 months of deployment, memorizing every building, every corridor, and every potential hiding spot. Now that knowledge served her well as she navigated through the chaos of the battle. Her first target was a Taliban machine gun team that had set up position on the roof of the motor pool building. They were raking the main courtyard with heavy fire, preventing the American defenders from moving to reinforce critical positions. Sarah could see muzzle flashes from their position and hear the distinctive sound of their PKM machine gun chattering continuously. Getting to them would require climbing the outside of the building while under fire, something that should have been impossible. But Sarah had spent years training in exactly these kinds of scenarios with her grandfather, who had believed that a warrior should be prepared for any situation. She approached the building from a blind side, away from the main battle. The Taliban team on the roof was focused entirely on their targets in the courtyard below and never looked back toward their own approach route. Sarah began climbing the building's exterior using drain pipes and window frames, moving silently despite the weight of her equipment. When she reached the roof level, she could see 3 fighters, 2 feeding ammunition to the machine gunner and 1 operating the weapon itself. They were so focused on their task that they never heard her approach from behind. Sarah's knife took the first ammunition handler silently. The second one turned just in time to see his partner fall, but Sarah's pistol ended his surprise before he could cry out. The machine gunner realized something was wrong when the ammunition stopped coming, but when he turned to check on his team, Sarah was already there. The entire rooftop engagement took less than 2 minutes. Sarah quickly examined the capture machine gun, a Russia-made PKM that she recognized from her training. Her grandfather had insisted she learn to operate enemy weapons, saying a true warrior used whatever tools were available. Now, she turned the machine gun on the Taliban forces below. From her elevated position, she could see several enemy groups that were invisible to the American defenders on the ground. She began engaging them systematically, using short bursts to conserve ammunition while maximizing casualties. The Taliban fighters below were caught completely off guard. They had expected to face American resistance from predictable positions, but now they were taking fire from above and behind from a position they thought was secure. Several groups broke cover to try to locate the new threat, exposing themselves to fire from the American defenders in the process. Sarah continued firing until the machine gun's ammunition was exhausted. Then, she gathered what equipment she could carry from the dead Taliban fighters. She found several fragmentation grenades, additional ammunition for her pistol, and a radio that was chattering with Taliban communications. The radio traffic told her something that made her blood run cold. This wasn't just an attack on the base. It was the opening phase of a much larger operation. Taliban forces were simultaneously attacking 3 other American positions in the region, and they had brought enough fighters to potentially overrun all of them. But more immediately concerning was what she heard about the base's situation. The Taliban had managed to cut off the main communications array early in the attack, which meant no calls for help had gotten out. The nearest American reinforcements were at a base over an hour away by helicopter, and they didn't even know an attack was in progress. Sarah realized that the defenders of this base were truly on their own. She left the motor pool roof and continued moving through the base, looking for her next opportunity to disrupt the Taliban attack. The enemy had superior numbers, but they were operating according to a plan that assumed predictable American defensive positions. By attacking from unexpected angles, Sarah could create confusion and force them to divert resources to deal with new threats. Her next target was an ammunition dump that the Taliban was trying to capture. If they succeeded, they would not only deny the Americans critical supplies, but also potentially use the captured ammunition to sustain their own attack. A group of about 15 Taliban fighters was advancing on the dump, which was defended by only 4 American personnel. Sarah positioned herself in a drainage ditch that ran alongside the approach route to the ammunition dump. As the Taliban group passed overhead, she waited for the perfect moment, then began her attack. The first grenade landed in the middle of the group, killing 3 fighters instantly and wounding several others. As the survivors scattered looking for cover, Sarah engaged them with her pistol from the drainage ditch, using the concrete walls as protection while picking off individual targets. The Taliban fighters were trained and experienced, but they had never faced anything like Sarah's combination of stealth, tactical awareness, and precise shooting. They couldn't locate her exact position, and every time they thought they had her pinned down, she would appear somewhere else, always with deadly effect. When the engagement ended, 12 of the 15 Taliban fighters were dead, and the remaining 3 had retreated in confusion. The ammunition dump remained in American hands, and Sarah had captured additional weapons and equipment, including an AK-47 with several magazines. But Sarah knew she was fighting against time as much as against the enemy. Despite her successes, the Taliban still vastly outnumbered the base defenders, and they were making steady progress toward their objectives. She could slow them down and inflict casualties, but she couldn't stop them entirely by herself. That's when she heard Lieutenant Commander Morrison's voice over a handheld radio she had taken from one of the dead Taliban fighters. The enemy was using captured American radio equipment, which meant she could monitor both sides of the battle. Morrison was trying to coordinate a defense of the command bunker, the base's nerve center. If the Taliban captured it, they would have access to classified materials and communication equipment that could compromise other American operations throughout the region. Morrison had gathered about 20 defenders around the bunker, but they were under attack by at least 50 Taliban fighters approaching from multiple directions. Sarah realized this was where she needed to focus her efforts. If the command bunker fell, the base would fall, and everyone on it would likely be killed or captured. She had to get there and help even the odds. But between her current position and the command bunker lay the most heavily contested area of the base. Taliban fighters had taken control of several buildings and were using them as firing positions to dominate the open ground. Any attempt to cross that area would be suicide for a normal person. Sarah wasn't normal. She studied the route carefully, identifying covered positions, potential firing lanes, and enemy strongpoints. Then she began moving, using every shadow and piece of cover available, sometimes crawling, sometimes running in short bursts, always staying one step ahead of the enemy's ability to track her movement. Halfway to the command bunker, she encountered a Taliban sniper who had taken position in the base's water tower. He was methodically picking off American defenders, and his elevated position gave him a commanding view of the entire area. Sarah could see his muzzle flashes from the tower's observation platform, about 60 feet above ground. Climbing the tower while under fire from other enemy positions would be almost impossible, but Sarah had an alternative plan. She had noticed that the water tower support structure included a maintenance ladder on the side, facing away from the main battle. If she could reach it without being seen, she might be able to climb up behind the sniper. Getting to the ladder required crossing 50 yards of open ground while Taliban fighters were advancing through the same area. Sarah waited for the right moment. When enemy attention was focused on an exchange of fire with American defenders, then sprinted across the open space. She made it to the base of the tower undetected and began climbing the maintenance ladder as quietly as possible. The sniper above was still firing, unaware that death was approaching from below. When Sarah reached the platform, she could see him clearly, a bearded fighter in his 30s who was using a Russian-made Dragunov sniper rifle with obvious skill. Sarah's approach was completely silent. The sniper never knew she was there until her knife slid between his ribs and into his heart. She took his rifle and his remaining ammunition, adding yet another weapon to her growing arsenal. From the water tower, Sarah had a commanding view of the entire battle. She could see the full scope of the Taliban attack and identify the key enemy positions that were causing the most problems for the American defenders. She also had a perfect sniper's nest from which to engage high-value targets. Sarah had never considered herself a sniper, but her grandfather had taught her precision shooting as part of her overall training. The Dragunov was a weapon she had trained with, and from her elevated position, she could reach targets throughout the base. She began systematically targeting Taliban leaders and heavy weapons teams. Through the rifle scope, she could identify fighters who were giving orders or coordinating attacks, and she eliminated them with single, precise shots. She also targeted machine gunners, mortar crews, and anyone carrying specialized equipment. Each shot created confusion in the Taliban ranks. Their leaders were falling without warning. Their heavy weapons were being silenced one by one, and they couldn't locate the source of the precise fire that was systematically dismantling their attack. Some groups began to break off their attacks to hunt for the sniper, which relieved pressure on the American defensive positions. Sarah continued firing until she had exhausted the Dragunov's ammunition. Then, she gathered her equipment and prepared to leave the tower. She had done significant damage to the Taliban attack, but the battle was far from over. As she climbed down from the tower, she could hear Morrison's voice on the radio again. The situation at the command bunker was becoming desperate. The Taliban had brought up a rocket-propelled grenade team and were preparing for a final assault that would likely overwhelm the remaining defenders. Sarah checked her remaining equipment. Her pistol with 2 magazines, the AK-47 with 3 magazines for grenades, and her knife. It wasn't much, but it would have to be enough. She began moving toward the command bunker, knowing that this would likely be the decisive engagement of the battle. If she could break the Taliban attack on the bunker, the remaining American forces might be able to hold out until help arrived. If she failed, everyone on the base would probably die. As she approached the bunker area, Sarah could see the situation was even worse than Morrison had described. The Taliban had completely surrounded the bunker, and they were closing in from all sides. The American defenders were trapped, running low on ammunition, and facing overwhelming odds. Sarah realized that conventional tactics wouldn't work here. The enemy was too numerous and too well-positioned. She needed to do something completely unexpected, something that would create maximum confusion and give the American defenders a chance to break out. She studied the Taliban positions and noticed something interesting. They had positioned their rocket-propelled grenade team near a fuel storage area that contained several large diesel tanks. If those tanks exploded, it would create chaos throughout the enemy formation and possibly give the Americans the opening they needed. But getting close enough to cause such an explosion would require Sarah to assault a position defended by at least 20 fighters, all of whom were alert and expecting an attack. It would be the most dangerous thing she had attempted since the battle began. Sarah checked her weapons one more time, said a silent prayer to her grandfather's memory, and began moving toward what might be her final battle. In her mind, she could hear the old warrior's voice. A true warrior does not count the enemy. She simply fights until there are no more enemies to fight. The most intense phase of the battle was about to begin, and Sarah was walking directly into the heart of Sarah approached the fuel storage area with the methodical precision her grandfather had drilled into her during countless training sessions. Every movement was calculated, every step placed with purpose. The Taliban fighters surrounding the command bunker were focused on their imminent final assault, which gave her the element of surprise she desperately needed. The fuel storage area consisted of 6 large diesel tanks, each containing thousands of gallons of fuel that kept the base's generators and vehicles running. The Taliban rocket-propelled grenade team had positioned themselves near these tanks, probably not realizing the explosive potential of their location. They were using the tanks as cover while they prepared to launch their final barrage against the command bunker. Sarah studied the enemy positions through the darkness. She counted 23 fighters in the immediate area, including the 3-man RPG team and their security element. They were well-trained and disciplined, maintaining proper spacing and overlapping fields of fire. Under normal circumstances, attacking such a position alone would be suicide. But Sarah had advantages they couldn't anticipate. Her grandfather had taught her that the greatest weapon a warrior could possess was the ability to think like the enemy while acting beyond their expectations. The Taliban fighters were expecting resistance from the bunker they were attacking, not from a lone operator approaching their rear. She began her approach from the northeast, using a drainage canal that ran along the perimeter of the fuel storage area. The concrete walls of the canal were about 4 feet high, providing concealment while she moved into position. The sound of ongoing gunfire throughout the base masked any noise she made. When she reached the optimal position, Sarah was approximately 30 meters from the nearest fuel tank and 40 meters from the RPG team. She could hear the Taliban fighters talking in low voices, coordinating their final assault. The RPG operator was preparing his weapon while his assistant readied additional rockets. Sarah's plan was simple in concept, but extremely dangerous in execution. She would use her remaining grenades to rupture the fuel tanks, creating a massive explosion that would eliminate the immediate threat and create chaos throughout the Taliban formation. But the timing would have to be perfect. Too early, and the enemy would have time to react. Too late, and the American defenders in the bunker might be caught in the blast. She pulled the pins from 2 grenades simultaneously, holding both spoons down while counting seconds in her head. Her grandfather had taught her to judge blast timing by instinct, a skill that had seemed academic during training, but now meant the difference between life and death. Sarah threw both grenades in high arcs toward the fuel tanks, then immediately began moving to a secondary position as she prepared her third grenade. The first 2 grenades exploded within seconds of each other, rupturing 2 of the diesel tanks and sending thousands of gallons of fuel spilling across the ground. The Taliban fighters reacted with trained discipline, immediately seeking cover and trying to identify the source of the attack. But they were standing in rapidly spreading pools of diesel fuel, and Sarah's third grenade, thrown with precise timing, landed in the middle of the largest fuel spill. The explosion that followed exceeded even Sarah's expectations. The ignited diesel created a massive fireball that engulfed the entire fuel storage area. The heat was so intense that the remaining fuel tanks ruptured in sympathetic explosions, creating a chain reaction that lit up the night sky like daylight. The Taliban fighters caught in the blast had no chance to escape. But the explosion also created new problems for Sarah. She was closer to the blast than she had intended, and the heat and concussion knocked her to the ground. Her ears were ringing from the explosion, and she could feel burns on her exposed skin from the radiant heat. More seriously, the massive fire had illuminated her position, making stealth impossible. Taliban fighters throughout the area could now see her clearly, and they were converging on her location from multiple directions. She estimated at least 30 fighters were moving toward her, firing as they advanced. Sarah rolled into the drainage canal and began moving quickly along its length, using the concrete walls for protection as automatic weapons' fire chattered overhead. Bullets struck the concrete around her, sending chips and dust flying, but the canal's construction was solid enough to stop the AK-47 rounds the Taliban fighters were using. As she moved, Sarah could hear Morrison's voice over the radio, coordinating a breakout from the command bunker. The destruction of the fuel storage area had eliminated the immediate threat to the bunker and created enough chaos to give the American defenders their first real opportunity since the battle began. But Sarah's situation was becoming desperate. The drainage canal led toward the base's vehicle maintenance area, but Taliban fighters were moving to cut off her escape route. She could hear them calling to each other in Pashto, coordinating their hunt for the lone American who had caused so much damage to their attack. When Sarah reached the end of the drainage canal, she found herself pinned down by enemy fire from 3 directions. Taliban fighters had taken positions in the maintenance bay's doorways and were systematically shooting at anything that moved. Getting out of the canal would expose her to certain death, but staying in it would only delay the inevitable as the enemy closed in. It was then that Sarah remembered something her grandfather had taught her about the difference between a soldier and a warrior. A soldier followed orders and used approved tactics. A warrior improvised, adapted, and used whatever means necessary to accomplish the mission. Sarah still had her AK-47 47, and approximately 90 rounds of ammunition. She also had her pistol with about 20 rounds, her knife, and most importantly, her grandfather's training in close-quarters combat. If she couldn't escape the trap, she would turn it into an opportunity. Instead of trying to flee, Sarah began moving back along the drainage canal toward the approaching Taliban fighters. They expected her to run away from them, not toward them, so they were advancing with confidence, believing they had her cornered. The first fighter who entered the drainage canal met Sarah's knife before he could raise his weapon. She took his position and used his body as cover while engaging the second fighter with her AK-47. The narrow confines of the canal worked to her advantage, forcing the enemy to approach in single file, where her superior training could overcome their numerical advantage. The Taliban fighters realized their tactical error and began calling for rocket-propelled grenades to blast Sarah out of the canal. But she didn't wait for them to bring up heavy weapons. Instead, she used the confusion of close-quarters fighting to break out of the canal and assault their positions in the maintenance bay. What followed was the most intense close-quarters battle of Sarah's life. She moved through the maintenance bay like a force of nature, using every technique her grandfather had taught her about fighting multiple opponents in confined spaces. Her AK-47 cleared the longer-range targets while her pistol and knife dealt with enemies who got too close. The Taliban fighters were brave and skilled, but they had never faced anything like Sarah's combination of tactical awareness, weapons proficiency, and hand-to-hand combat ability. She seemed to be everywhere at once, always one step ahead of their attempts to coordinate their attacks against her. When the shooting in the maintenance bay finally stopped, 14 Taliban fighters lay dead, and Sarah was covered in blood, some her own, but most from her enemies. She had taken a bullet graze across her left shoulder and several cuts from flying debris, but she was still capable of fighting. More importantly, her assault on the maintenance bay had broken the Taliban's attempt to encircle the command bunker. Morrison's breakout had succeeded, and American forces were now advancing to retake key positions throughout the base. But the battle was far from over. Sarah could hear heavy fighting continuing in other areas of the base, and Taliban reinforcements were still arriving from outside the perimeter. The enemy commander was clearly committed to taking the base regardless of losses, and he still had enough fighters to potentially succeed if the Americans couldn't maintain their momentum. Sarah gathered what equipment she could from the dead Taliban fighters, including additional ammunition and several more grenades. She also found a radio that was still functioning, allowing her to monitor Taliban communications and coordination efforts. What she heard over the radio made her realize the true scope of what she was facing. The Taliban force attacking the base was larger than anyone had estimated, nearly 300 fighters in total, with the main assault force just beginning to arrive. The attacks she had defeated so far were essentially the advance guard, designed to soften up the defenses before the real assault began. The Taliban commander was now personally leading a force of over 100 fresh fighters in a final push to capture the base. They were approaching from the south, where the base's defenses were weakest, and they had brought heavy weapons including mortars and additional RPG teams. Sarah realized that despite everything she had accomplished, the base was still in danger of being overrun. Morrison's forces were scattered throughout the base, dealing with continuing attacks from multiple directions, and they wouldn't be able to concentrate enough firepower to stop the main Taliban assault. Once again, Sarah found herself in a position where she was the only person who could make a difference. But this time, she would be facing not just a few dozen fighters, but an entire company of enemy troops led by their most experienced commander. Sarah checked her remaining equipment. Her AK-47 with 2 full magazines, her pistol with 1 magazine, 3 grenades, and her knife. She also had the radio, which would allow her to coordinate with Morrison's forces if the opportunity arose. It wasn't much equipment for facing 100 enemies, but Sarah had learned long ago that victory in battle wasn't determined by the size of your arsenal. It was determined by the strength of your spirit and the clarity of your purpose. Her grandfather had once told her that a true warrior's greatest weapon wasn't any gun or blade, but the willingness to do whatever was necessary to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. Looking around at the base she had called home for 6 months, thinking about the Americans who were depending on her and the patients she had left in the supply bunker, Sarah felt that willingness burning in her chest like a flame. The Taliban's main force was approaching from the south, expecting to face demoralized and weakened defenders. Instead, they were about to encounter something they had never seen before and would never forget. A warrior who had been forged in the ancient traditions of combat, but equipped with modern weapons and an unshakable determination to win. Sarah began moving south toward the sound of approaching vehicles and the voices of enemy fighters who thought they had already won. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The decisive phase of the battle was about to begin, and Sarah Chun was ready for it. Sarah reached the southern perimeter of the base just as the first Taliban vehicles came into view. The enemy commander had brought a convoy of pickup trucks and captured military vehicles, all loaded with fighters and heavy weapons. She counted at least 12 vehicles in the main column, with motorcycle scouts ranging ahead to check for mines and obstacles. From her concealed position behind a concrete barrier, Sarah could see the Taliban commander clearly through her capture binoculars. He was a tall, bearded man in his 40s, wearing a distinctive white turban and carrying himself with the confidence of someone who had never been defeated in battle. His fighters obviously respected him, following his hand signals with immediate precision. The commander was deploying his forces with professional skill. He positioned mortar teams on high ground overlooking the base, established machine gun positions to cover the assault routes, and organized his fighters into disciplined attack groups. This wasn't the chaotic rush of irregular fighters. It was a coordinated military operation led by someone with formal training. Sarah realized she was facing not just superior numbers, but superior leadership. The Taliban commander clearly understood modern infantry tactics, and he was applying them with deadly efficiency. If she was going to stop this assault, she would need to be not just a warrior, but a tactician. Her grandfather had taught her that the key to defeating a larger force was to disrupt their command and control, forcing them to react to her initiative rather than follow their own plan. The Taliban commander was the center of their tactical coordination. If she could eliminate him, the assault might collapse into chaos. But the commander had positioned himself well, surrounded by bodyguards and staying behind cover. Getting close enough to engage him would require Sarah to penetrate multiple layers of security while under fire from his entire force. Sarah studied the terrain and the enemy deployment, looking for weaknesses she could exploit. The Taliban were setting up their attack along predictable routes, using the same approaches that would be obvious to any military commander. But Sarah's grandfather had taught her to think beyond conventional tactics. She noticed that the Taliban had positioned their mortar teams on a ridge about 400 meters south of the base. The mortars were their primary advantage in the coming assault. They could rain explosive shells down on the American defenders while staying safely out of range of small arms fire. If Sarah could eliminate the mortars, it would significantly reduce the Taliban's firepower advantage. Getting to the mortar position would require crossing open ground while under observation from multiple enemy positions. For a conventional force, it would be impossible. For someone trained in her grandfather's methods of stealth and deception, it was merely extremely dangerous. Sarah began her approach using every technique she had learned about moving undetected across hostile terrain. She crawled through drainage ditches, used destroyed vehicles for cover, and took advantage of the shadows cast by the base's burning buildings. The ongoing chaos of the battle helped mask her movement, as Taliban fighters were focused on their own objectives rather than watching for threats from unexpected directions. It took her 20 minutes to cover the 400 meters to the mortar position, moving in short rushes between covered positions. When she finally reached the base of the ridge, she could hear the Taliban mortar crews preparing their weapons and calculating firing solutions for targets within the base. The mortar position consisted of four 82mm mortars with their crews, protected by a security element of 8 riflemen. The crews were professional and disciplined, working with the efficiency of soldiers who had used these weapons many times before. Sarah studied their positions from concealment, planning her attack carefully. The mortars were spaced about 20 meters apart along the ridge line, with a security element positioned to watch the approaches from the base. None of them were expecting an attack from behind their own lines. Sarah's assault on the mortar position began at 0347 hours and lasted exactly 4 minutes and 30 seconds. She approached the furthest mortar first, using her knife to silently eliminate the 2-man crew before they realized she was there. She then used their own mortar to destroy the second position, dropping a high-explosive shell directly into their ammunition storage. The explosion alerted the rest of the mortar position, but it also created confusion about the direction of the attack. The security element initially assumed they were taking fire from American forces at the base and began firing in the wrong direction. Sarah used this confusion to assault the third mortar position with grenades, killing the crew and destroying the weapon. The security element finally realized the attack was coming from within their own perimeter, but by then, Sarah was already moving toward the final mortar. The last crew tried to turn their weapon on Sarah, but mortars aren't designed for direct fire missions at close range. Sarah's AK-47 cut down the crew before they could complete their firing solution, and she destroyed the mortar tube with her final grenade. The entire mortar position was eliminated, but Sarah's assault had alerted the Taliban forces below. She could see fighters moving up the ridge toward her position, and radio chatter indicated that the commander was furious about the loss of his artillery support. Sarah gathered what equipment she could from the destroyed position, including several mortar shells that hadn't been expended in the fight. She also found a Taliban radio that was tuned to the command frequency, allowing her to monitor the commander's orders directly. What she heard confirmed her assessment of the enemy leader's tactical skill. Instead of rushing reinforcements to the ridge in an uncoordinated response, he was methodically repositioning his forces to deal with a new threat while maintaining pressure on the base's defenders. He clearly understood that Sarah was operating alone, and he was planning to trap her on the ridge while continuing his primary assault. But the loss of his mortars had forced the Taliban commander to modify his attack plan, and Sarah recognized an opportunity in his tactical adjustments. He was pulling fighters from his eastern flank to reinforce the ridge assault, which would weaken his coverage of that approach route. Sarah began moving east along the ridge line, staying ahead of the Taliban search teams, while working her way toward a position where she could observe the main enemy formation. She needed to identify the commander's exact location and find a way to get close enough to engage him. From her new vantage point, Sarah could see the entire Taliban force laid out below her. The commander had positioned himself in a command post built around 2 pickup trucks about 600 meters from the base perimeter. He was surrounded by communications equipment and protected by at least 20 fighters, but Sarah could see him clearly through her binoculars. More importantly, she could see something the commander apparently hadn't noticed. Morrison and his SEAL team had managed to organize a counterattack force and were moving into position to assault the Taliban's eastern flank, exactly where the enemy commander had weakened his lines to hunt for Sarah. Sarah realized she had an opportunity to coordinate her actions with Morrison's assault. If she could create a major distraction at the right moment, it might give the SEALs the opening they needed to break through the Taliban lines and reach the command post. She checked her remaining equipment: her AK-47 with about 30 rounds, her pistol with 15 rounds, her knife, and 3 mortar shells she had taken from the destroyed position. The mortar shells gave her an idea that would have seemed impossible to anyone who hadn't been trained by her grandfather. Shun Wei had taught Sarah that any weapon could be used in ways its designers never intended, if a warrior was creative enough and desperate enough. The mortar shells weren't designed to be used as improvised explosives, but with the right modifications, they could create the kind of spectacular diversion she needed. Sarah began preparing the mortar shells for her improvised plan, using techniques her grandfather had taught her for creating explosive devices from military ordnance. It was dangerous work that required precise handling, but she had practiced similar procedures countless times during her training. As she worked, Sarah monitored the Taliban radio traffic and Morrison's movements through her binoculars. The timing would have to be perfect, too early, and the Taliban would have time to respond to her diversion. Too late, and Morrison's assault would fail before she could support it. At 0412 hours, Sarah saw Morrison's team moving into their final assault positions. She activated her improvised explosive devices and began moving toward the Taliban command post, using the ridge line for concealment while carrying enough explosive power to level a city block. What she was attempting had never been tried before in military history. A single operator, armed with improvised weapons and facing overwhelming odds, was about to assault a fortified command post while coordinating with a simultaneous attack for friendly forces. The margin for error was essentially zero. Any mistake would result in her death and the failure of Morrison's counterattack. But Sarah had been trained for exactly this kind of impossible situation. Her grandfather had always said that a true warrior's greatest victories came not from following conventional tactics, but from doing what the enemy believed was impossible. The Taliban commander was about to discover just how impossible things could be when facing someone who had been forged in the ancient traditions of warfare, but equipped with modern weapons and an unshakable will to win. Sarah began her final approach toward the command post, knowing that the next few minutes would determine not just her own fate, but the survival of everyone on the base. In her mind, she could hear her grandfather's voice one last time. A warrior fights not for glory or conquest, but to protect those who cannot protect themselves. Remember this, and you will never know defeat. The decisive moment of the battle had arrived. Sarah reached her final assault position at 0415 hours, exactly 3 minutes before Morrison's team was scheduled to begin their attack. She was now within 200 meters of the Taliban command post, close enough to see individual faces through her binoculars, but still concealed by the rocky terrain of the ridgeline. The Taliban commander was standing next to his communications equipment, coordinating the final phases of his assault on the base. Sarah could hear his voice clearly over the captured radio, giving orders with the calm confidence of someone who believed victory was assured. His bodyguard were alert, but relaxed, focused outward toward potential threats from the base rather than watching their own rear areas. Sarah's improvised explosive devices were ready. She had modified the 3 mortar shells to create directional charges that would focus their explosive force towards specific targets. The largest device was designed to destroy the communications equipment and eliminate the command group. The other 2 were positioned to create chaos and confusion among the Taliban fighters while clearing an escape route for her assault. At 0417 hours, Sarah heard Morrison's voice over her American radio, using a coded phrase that meant his team was beginning their final approach. She had exactly 60 seconds to create the diversion that would give the SEALs their best chance of success. Sarah activated the timer on her first explosive device and began moving toward the command post. The charge would detonate in 90 seconds, giving her just enough time to get into position while ensuring the explosion would come at the perfect moment to support Morrison's attack. She covered the first 100 meters quickly, using the natural cover of rocks and scrub brush to stay hidden from the Taliban sentries. Her grandfather's training in stealth movement served her well. Despite moving at nearly a run, she made no sound that could be detected over the background noise of the ongoing battle. When Sarah was 50 meters from the command post, the first explosion lit up the night behind the Taliban lines. The blast was enormous, creating a fireball that could be seen for miles and sending shockwaves through the enemy formation. Taliban fighters throughout the area turned toward the explosion, trying to understand what had happened. In that moment of confusion, Sarah activated her second device and continued her assault. She was now close enough to hear individual conversations among the Taliban fighters, close enough to see the commander's face as he tried to understand what was happening to his carefully planned attack. The second explosion came 30 seconds later, this one positioned to cut off reinforcements from reaching the command post. The blast created a wall of fire and debris that isolated the command group from the rest of the Taliban force, exactly as Sarah had planned. Morrison's assault began at precisely 0418 hours, just as Sarah reached the perimeter of the command post. She could hear the distinctive sound of American weapons firing in coordinated bursts as the SEAL team engaged the weakened Taliban eastern flank. The enemy was now under attack from two directions simultaneously, with explosions behind their lines creating confusion and panic. Sarah's assault on the command post itself began with her third and largest explosive device. The directional charge was positioned to destroy the communications equipment and eliminate most of the command group in a single blast. When it detonated, the explosion was so intense that it temporarily blinded everyone within 100 meters. Sarah used those crucial seconds of blindness and confusion to penetrate the command post perimeter. Her AK-47 cut down the first two bodyguards before they could recover from the blast, and her pistol eliminated a third fighter who was trying to locate her position. The Taliban commander was wounded, but still alive, protected by the armor plating of his pickup truck. He was reaching for his weapon when Sarah appeared beside him like a ghost, her knife already in motion. The man who had planned to overrun the American base died, without understanding how a single opponent had destroyed his entire operation. But Sarah's assault on the command post was just the beginning of the Taliban collapse. Without their commander's leadership and communications, the various Taliban units throughout the battlefield began operating independently, making tactical decisions based on incomplete information. Morrison's SEAL team exploited this confusion brilliantly, advancing rapidly through the disorganized enemy formation. Sarah used the captured Taliban radio to monitor their communications, listening as unit after unit reported being under attack, and requesting orders from a command post that no longer existed. The disciplined military operation she had faced just minutes before was dissolving into chaos. With the Taliban command structure destroyed, Sarah began targeting their remaining leadership. She moved through the battlefield systematically, identifying and eliminating squad leaders, heavy weapon specialists, and anyone trying to reorganize the scattered fighters. Her grandfather had taught her that destroying an army's ability to coordinate was more effective than simply killing individual soldiers. The battle that had seemed hopeless just an hour before was now turning into a rout. Taliban fighters were abandoning their positions and retreating in growing disorder, while Morrison's forces advanced to retake control of the base perimeter. The sound of gunfire was decreasing as scattered enemy groups either surrendered or fled into the surrounding desert. By 0500 hours, organized Taliban resistance had ended. Sarah found herself standing in the ruins of the command post, surrounded by the debris of what had been a formidable enemy force just hours before. She was covered in dust and blood, her uniform torn and blackened by explosions, but she was alive and victorious. Morrison reached her position 20 minutes later, leading a squad of SEALs who had been fighting continuously since the battle began. When he saw Sarah standing among the destroyed Taliban equipment, his expression showed a mixture of amazement and respect that she had never seen before. "Petty Officer Chun," he said, his voice carrying a note of awe. "What exactly did you do here?" Sarah looked around at the battlefield, thinking about how to answer that question. In the space of 3 hours, she had eliminated over 50 enemy fighters, destroyed their artillery support, disrupted their communications, and eliminated their command structure. She had turned what should have been a catastrophic defeat into a decisive victory. "I did what needed to be done, sir," she replied, which was the only answer that really mattered. Morrison studied her for a long moment, clearly trying to reconcile the quiet nurse he thought he knew with the warrior who had just accomplished something that would have been difficult for an entire SEAL platoon. "Where did you learn to fight like this?" he asked. "My grandfather taught me," Sarah said simply. Over the next several hours, as the base was secured and the wounded were treated, the full scope of what Sarah had accomplished became clear. The Taliban had brought nearly 300 fighters to the assault, backed by mortars, machine guns, and rocket-propelled grenades. They had been led by an experienced commander who had successfully overrun several American positions in previous battles. Sarah had faced this overwhelming force essentially alone and had not just survived, but had completely destroyed their ability to conduct coordinated operations. Military analysts who later studied the battle would call it one of the most remarkable individual combat achievements in modern warfare. But for Sarah, the most important moment came when she returned to the supply bunker where she had left her patients at the beginning of the battle. All of them were safe, including the 2 Taliban prisoners who had unknowingly provided the intelligence that started everything. As she checked on their wounds and updated their medical charts, Sarah reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. She had joined the Navy to save lives, not take them. She had hidden her combat skills because she wanted to be seen as a healer, not a warrior. The battle had forced her to reveal abilities she had hoped never to use, but it had also shown her something important about the relationship between healing and fighting. Sometimes, the best way to save lives was to be willing to take them. Sometimes, the greatest act of healing was to eliminate the source of injury and death. Morrison approached her as she was finishing her medical duties. "Chen, I need to ask you something," he said. "What do you want to do now? After what you've accomplished here, you could write your own ticket to any unit in the military. Special Operations Command would take you in a heartbeat." Sarah considered the question carefully. She thought about her grandfather, who had spent his life training her for combat, but had always emphasized that a true warrior fought to protect, not to conquer. She thought about the wounded soldiers she had treated over the past 6 months, and how much satisfaction she had found in healing rather than harming. "I want to stay where I am, sir," she said finally. "I'm a nurse. That's what I've always wanted to be." Morrison nodded, though she could see he didn't entirely understand her decision. "What about your other skills? Are you just going to pretend they don't exist?" "No, Sarari Plaiv. But I'll use them only when I have to. Only when there's no other choice." That conversation took place 6 years ago. Since then, Sarah has continued working as a Navy nurse, serving in hospitals and field medical units around the world. Her official service record shows nothing unusual, just the steady career of a dedicated medical professional. But within the special operations community, there are whispers about the nurse who can become something else when the situation demands it. Stories are told about medical personnel who have faced impossible odds and somehow prevailed, though the details are usually classified and the names are never mentioned. Sarah herself has never spoken publicly about the events at the forward operating base in Afghanistan. When asked about her service, she talks about the patients she has treated and the lives she has saved through medical intervention, not military action. But she still carries the small locked case her grandfather gave her, and she still maintains the skills he taught her. Because a true warrior is always prepared, even when she hopes those preparations will never be needed. The Taliban attack on the forward operating base was officially reported as a successful defense by a combined force of American personnel. The individual contributions of specific service members were classified, and the details of how the attack was defeated remain secret. But in the military medical community, there's sometimes talk about Petty Officer Sarah Chun, the nurse who proved that healing and fighting are not always opposite skills. Sometimes they are two sides of the same commitment to protecting those who cannot protect themselves. Her grandfather would have been proud.